What is up, weather enthusiasts? I'm your host, Pat's Path Predictor. Let's get right into the weather. Alright, so here's the situation we have for you, ladies and gentlemen. We have a few things that we're going to be talking about today, mainly discussing conditions and areas of potential development that we are paying attention to down the road. I have been watching the conditions, and I have been watching the trends across much of the tropics, and there are several very concerning signs that I do want to go ahead and go over today. We kind of highlighted some of them yesterday, but I want to go ahead and go over some more of them since we have new information and new data to go over. And with that being said, let's go ahead and dive right into it right here. So this is what we're going to start off with. We're going to start off with the satellite imagery right here across much of the Atlantic right here. And what you're seeing right here is basically you're seeing convection firing off in the intertropical convergence zone, a tropical wave coming off the coast of Africa as we speak, and some Sahara dust in parts of the northern tropical and subtropical Atlantic over here, and parts of the Atlantic basin over here north of the main development region. That Sahara dust is going to be kind of a main focal point for today's video because I've been looking at new trends, I've been looking at new wind patterns, and I've been looking at some very concerning signs that the Sahara dust will be weakening much sooner than expected, so we will need to pay attention to that going forward. Also watching the shear environment in the Caribbean as well, in fact the shear across much of the Atlantic right here, seeing how everything has been panning out, so we can go ahead and kind of discuss that a little bit further, but ultimately the conditions that we're noting right now is basically the wind shear patterns fluctuating up, down, up, down, up, down. Typically what we're seeing for July, but what's not expected is across much of the MDR, the shear has dropped precipitously, and the moisture has increased to a point where we're getting to the point where, you know, Sahara dust and all of that is starting to become less of a factor in parts of inhibiting convection. And this isn't even like late July or anything like that. This is only July 8th, ladies and gentlemen. We're already looking at patterns of some of the dust pushing up to Europe instead of the North Atlantic, which would normally bring dry air to inhibit tropical development, particularly in the deep tropics and in the main development region. So those are things that you're going to want to pay attention to. And going ahead and kind of starting off with the models right here, we're going to go ahead and pull up the European. This is Atlantic-wide across much of the tropics just to kind of show you and to kind of start off with. Now, there are a couple of little features I am noting, at least some of the operational runs are noting in parts of the main development region that I do want to briefly discuss as well, but we'll actually go ahead and start with that right now, as a matter of fact. So this is the European, this is the 0Z, and we already have a low-pressure system tagged, partly due to a tropical wave currently in parts of the MDR right there, kind of fluctuating and either being designated or not. It's kind of a flickery signal right here I'm noticing right here, but it is starting to notice, and you do see potentially a little bit of a contour starting to wrap around. However, I don't particularly anticipate development to happen with this system because it's in too dry of an air mass, even though it's more moist than what we were anticipating. It's a more moist environment than average. It's still too dry for tropical development at this current point. Even if it does, it's mainly going to stay in the main development region, and it won't really impact any land if it somehow unexpectedly does do that, mainly because of the wind shear in the Caribbean. So that's kind of what we're seeing with the European at this current point. Another model that's kind of picking up on this too is the Canadian run, the CMC right here. The 12Z CMC is also showing this right here. You're noticing how it's kind of a low pressure system flickering a little bit. It kind of was designated there for a little bit, but after that, it's just kind of, it kind of stayed around relatively disorganized and all of that stuff. So that's something to keep a very close eye on as well. Do I think a low pressure system is possible in the main development region? Yeah. Do I think tropical development is currently possible with that system? No, the conditions are not particularly favorable in that area right now, but they are getting more favorable than what we were potentially thinking beforehand. So without further ado, let's go ahead and go back to the European, and we'll go back to the moisture component for you, ladies and gentlemen. So the moisture component to all of this, essentially, you're noticing this low-pressure system is kind of surrounded by dry air, the Sahara dust to the north. ITCZ starts to weaken a little bit to the south, so it doesn't really have a good chance of development at this current point, but you're going to want to pay attention to how the conditions are going to start shifting moving forward, because you're noticing a pretty decent moisture surge across much of the eastern tropical Atlantic right here, parts of the MDR and northern tropical regions right there. and you're noticing more and more of the Sahara dust getting picked up. Instead of moving into the Atlantic, it's starting to head towards Europe right here. And how you can tell from this is mainly by the wind barbs and where the wind is going. This is at 700 to 300 hectopascals right here. So this is a little bit from mid to upper level regions right here. But at least from right there, those wind barbs are moving towards Europe. You're seeing instead of the more more northerly and easterly winds, you're seeing more kind of a 180 flip right here with more southerly and southwesterly winds pushing a lot of this dry air to France, to the Iberian Peninsula, to much of Morocco, to the United Kingdom, Ireland, at least for right now. And those wind barbs continue to move. And the reason for this is there is a high pressure system expected to move into and develop along the northern regions of Morocco right here. And a high pressure system moves in the winds move in a clockwise location, and those clockwise winds are going to allow more of the Sahara dust to move into Europe. At least in the short term, we'll have to pay attention to that. But ultimately, you're noticing the wind patterns really starting to shift across much of the mid-latitudes right here, and instead of a lot of this dry air and a lot of this dust like we typically see moving into the northern Atlantic, you're seeing more of a Europe favorable pattern right here, and this is pretty persistent for a long time right here. This is persistent through the entire model run right here, ladies and gentlemen. Those wind barbs, they kind of remain at this current point, and they kind of just stay there for much of it. And what this is ultimately going to do is it's going to drive more of the Sahara dust, and it's going to drive more of this dry air to Europe and all of that. Also been paying attention to the Mediterranean winds and all of that. Those are also weaker than what we were initially anticipating. So you're looking at a lot less dry air and a lot less Sahara dust than what we were seeing last year and in the climatological average. And to kind of exacerbate this and show you this further, we can go ahead and show you the precipitable water anomaly. And the precipitable water anomaly is pretty interesting to say the very least. What you're noticing with this right here, and this isn't just in one region right here, with the exception of the Eastern Caribbean Sea, the entire Atlantic is considerably more moist than it was previously last year. And not just last year, but also in 2023, 2022, heck, even 2021, and the climatological mean. This is going to be a huge problem right here, ladies and gentlemen. It's going to be a problem in the long term, especially. And the reason I say that is because what you're noticing with this right here is you're seeing this precipitable water right here, and you're probably thinking, okay, Patrick, this is just one frame. What's it going to look like in the future? Well, if you take a quick look at this, you're looking at more moisture coming off the coast of Africa over here, ladies and gentlemen, and you're noticing how the dry air kind of remains concentrated and it kind of gets pushed along and is replaced by much more moisture across much of the northern tropical regions right here and in the subtropics. A lot of the dry air that I'm noting right here is in the subtropical region right here and has mainly been influenced by more mid-latitude cyclones or anything more than anything like that. At least in the tropics, we're getting more open for business right here. And yes, there is some drier air that's going to be moving into parts of the MDR, but that is followed by a pretty significant moisture surge across much of the Atlantic moving forward by about 10 days out. And this continues to persist for quite some time, and then another moisture surge moves after that. But ultimately, what you're noticing here is the dry air that usually inhabits much of the main development region is not as much of a factor as it was previously. And that is a very big concern of mine moving forward. Another thing that I want to note right here is just kind of how fluctuative this has become, because before, what you would notice is the Sahara dust would move across much of the main development region into the Caribbean and affect the United States, particularly in the southern part of it, like the deep south, Florida, Texas, particularly those areas. But what we're noticing right here is you're noticing there's less dust to really play with that and we saw last year. Like last year, we talked about this in July. The reason we didn't have much development taking place in the month of July was because of all the dry air. The wind shear was collapsing, the water temperatures were absolutely surging, but the dry air was what kind of kept it as a bit of a fail-safe and kind of what ultimately saved the season from being more devastating than it could have been, because we were predicting 23, 25 named storms last year. Now, we only got about 18 named storms, as of my understanding right here, about 18 compared to the 23 to 25. Still a lot of systems if you think about that, particularly the systems that had a lot of power too. This was a very power heavy season as well. You had Beryl, you had Francine, you had Helene, Milton, Raphael as well was a Category 3 hurricane when it made landfall in Cuba. So you had a lot of power with this, but you didn't have a lot of other storms to work with. This year could be a little bit different in a vein. They are predicting a less active season than they were at this point last year. However, I think we're on course to kind of remain where we were last year in terms of tropical activity, if not potentially beat it out a little bit. And the reason I say that is because there are less fail modes affiliated with this. There's a negative PNA that influences the climatology of this. There's also the fact that we're seeing, as you see with this chart right here, a lot more moisture to work with. And there's also a lot less wind shear in the main development region and a lot of these other regions too, like the Gulf and the Atlantic Basin and all of those areas. The trade winds are significantly weaker too, and we'll go ahead and show you those in a second. But by and large, all the conditions that we're looking at right here, pretty concerning to say the very least. And you're looking at this, yes, there is some wind shear in the eastern part of the MDR, but across much of the central and western MDR, you're not seeing as much. A lot of it's lifted further up to the north, and a lot of it is what's drifting a lot of the Sahara dust back up to Europe right here. And ultimately, a pattern like that is kind of indicative of, okay, this is something that could actually start developing and breaking out a lot faster than what we were anticipating. It has a much greater risk of doing that than it did previously. Last year, we were looking at this and we were thinking that something might happen given that Beryl just came out of nowhere, pulled something out of its ass, and became a Category 5 hurricane in early July. That was kind of it for quite a while until August when Debbie started to develop. But ultimately, in that time frame, it was mainly the dry air that kept it, and it wasn't until another active MJO pattern where we finally started to see more activity with Debbie and Ernesto taking charge as well. But looking at the wind shear patterns once again, I got a little sidetracked right there. Ultimately, what you're noticing with this is you're noticing more favorable wind shear conditions across much of the MDR, and you're noticing that it's a lot more fluctuative across parts of the Gulf, across parts of the Atlantic Basin, and in the subtropics as well. The only area that has consistent wind shear, and even that is fluctuating to some extent in these new model runs, is the Caribbean. But that's starting to show signs of weakening. And yes, there is some strength that's still affiliated with this, but ultimately, you're noticing the signs right here. You're noticing how much weaker it is compared to what we were looking at previously. Before, we were looking at a pretty big, stubborn area of wind shear. That's not happening anymore. Instead, what you're noticing with this is a weaker wind shear, and yes, it spreads across more of the Caribbean temporarily, but instead of like 50-plus knots, you're looking at maybe 30 at that current point, maybe 40 max instead of like 50, 60, 70 knots of wind shear. And this is for July 16th right here, ladies and gentlemen. Now, don't take these at face value, obviously. This is a little bit far out to really jump to conclusions and all that. But if you pay attention to the patterns and you look at the consistency of the model runs, that is something you need to pay attention to. And that's why I say it's a huge problem for many people that's going to be affected this hurricane season. And this is also predominantly why I said that the Caribbean and the Gulf regions are the two most areas that are going to be at risk, the two greatest areas that are going to be at risk for this hurricane season, because the wind shear is ahead of schedule. The dry air is starting to collapse earlier than expected. And I don't even need to mention the water temperatures, which we'll get to in just a second, but ultimately, what you're noticing is a much more tropical development-favored pattern compared to what we were seeing last year and in the climatological mean, both the moisture and in the shear. Now, like I said, development is at this current point. We're not going to see it tomorrow or anything like that. But it is imminent in the long term because of these conditions. It's not imminent in the short term, but it is in the long term because of these better conditions for tropical development. So with that being said, I want to go ahead and pull up the final piece before we get to the water temperatures. And I want to pull up the piece which I've been taking a look at, and that is the trade winds. The trade winds are what ultimately kind of determine what is more favorable and what is less favorable for tropical development. This is the current pattern that we have right now. As we talked about in yesterday's video, the tropics have favorable trade winds, more favorable trade winds to deal with, less trade winds. That's going to allow for more water to heat up. That's going to allow for less wind shear to take place. And this isn't just an isolated pattern. This is going to continue across a lot of these regions, across the Gulf. You're going to see the Gulf really warm up. You're going to see parts of the Atlantic Basin also warm up as well, although the trade winds are a bit more fluctuative over there. But by far, the big winner is going to be the main development region, not because of how much weaker the trade winds are than what we would normally see. What we're also looking at is the consistency. This is staying like this for at least the next 2 weeks. If this was one thing where, this is a situation where it stayed for a few days and then it fluctuated, that would be a bit of a different story. But this is consistent. And what that's ultimately going to do is it's going to allow for more the water temperatures to rise, and it's going to allow for more power potential for tropical development. It's also going to increase the probability of tropical development once the dry air gets out, because all you need from that is the theta E, and you need that water temperature and the evaporation to really get things going. Wind shear is not going to be an issue anymore. That's pretty consistent across the board in the MDR. We're looking at much more favorable areas of wind shear. We just need the dry air to get out, and that dry air is weakening by the day. And that is something to pay attention to. And now we can go ahead and pull up the SSTs right here, because these SST charts are only going to get continually concerning. Looking at the Gulf right here, water temperatures have surged once again. We're already at 31 degrees Celsius actually across parts of Louisiana coast right here, 30 degrees Celsius across parts of the Texas coast. If you're in Galveston, it would not be the most comfortable to swim in today, or quite frankly, for the next couple of months, because of how warm these waters are getting. And across the Gulf, 29 plus degrees Celsius. And you have a couple 30 degrees Celsius areas too in parts of the Gulf as well, near the loop current. But that's something you're going to want to pay attention to as well. That's even more considering this is over deep water. And these are over areas where ocean heat content is going to absolutely surge for the month of July. Shifting over to the Caribbean right here very quickly. Looking at this right here, yes, it's not as warm as what we were seeing last year, but it's still a constant 28 plus degrees Celsius waters across much of this region. That is absolutely astronomical at this current point. And those water temperatures are only going to continue to surge. We're going to see potentially 29, maybe quite a few 30s in further out from the Cuba right here into parts of the northwestern Caribbean. That's going to put more of the United States coast and the Yucatan Peninsula in the line of fire. And in the MDR, you're already noticing a lot of this warming happening, particularly in the western half of the MDR. Eastern half of the MDR has cooled off a little bit, mainly due to the ITCZ and because of the tropical waves that are coming off. But ultimately, that's at that current point, it's still not enough to cool these waters down. And as we get through July and as we get through early August, and these water temperatures continue to surge, that's going to allow for OHC to really start to turn up, ladies and gentlemen. Here's the ocean heat content for today. And taking a look at it, look at the MDR. You're already seeing multiple pockets of over 100 to 125 plus OHC in some of these regions right here. Now, granted, they're very far to the south, and tropical development is not likely to happen down there because of the Coriolis force. But the point still stands, and that is going to continue to drift further and further and further up to the north. In the Caribbean, that OHC is continuing to get more concentrated, continuing to show more power, and you're starting to see a few more gaps across parts of the southwestern Caribbean and in this part of the Caribbean and the central Caribbean, from Colombia to the Hispaniola area right here, starting to fill in a little bit. But over here, what you're seeing with the Atlantic Basin, more OHC, those water temperatures are getting deeper. And what did I always say? That's putting more of the mid-Atlantic, New England, and Canada in the line of fire. So those are all things that we need to be concerned about right here. And the reason I spend so much time on it here is just to kind of set up the stage and kind of go, okay, this is what you need to pay attention to once tropical development starts. And we will continue to keep you updated on those probabilities here on the Pat's Path Predictor channel. But with that being said, we're going to go ahead and close the video out right here. I really hope you enjoyed it. Be sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel if you are new. The goal, as always, is to get more people engaged with weather. If you want to help out, hang out, or ask us questions, be sure to join the Storms United Discord server. The link to that is in the end screen. And with that being said, have a wonderful day, guys. Stay safe. If you made it this far, comment COPS called down below.